According to the treaty's simple terms, humanity, the battered newcomers to the galactic stage, merely had to send a single transport to the summit to sign away our outer colonies. The alien council sneered at it as a formality, demanding just a little diplomatic shuttle to prove we finally understood our place at the bottom of the cosmic food chain. Earth, however, had other plans. When the jump drives tore the fabric of space outside the council station, the aliens didn't see a diplomatic dinky. They saw 4 miles of black tungsten, depleted uranium, and nuclear fire. The air on Station Prime always smelled like crushed pennies and overripe cantaloupe. It was a byproduct of the atmospheric scrubbers trying to accommodate 30 different oxygen-breathing species, failing to satisfy any of them. Arthur adjusted the collar of his suit. It was stiff, starched too heavily by the station's automated dry cleaners, and the rough fabric was busy sawing a red line into his neck. He swallowed, tasting stale coffee, and the sour bile of a hangover he hadn't quite managed to kick. He was Earth's lowest-ranking diplomatic attaché, stationed here simply because he had the least impressive resume in the Geneva Corps. His job wasn't to negotiate. His job was to nod, take notes, and look appropriately humbled. Beside him, Councillor Vial shifted. Vial belonged to the Tressian Concord, a species that looked vaguely like a cross between a mantis and a greyhound, wrapped in iridescent silk. Vial's mandibles clicked, a rhythmic, wet sound that meant he was either amused or hungry. With Tressians, the two were rarely mutually exclusive. "Your people are late, Representative Arthur," Vial said. The translator implant buried in Arthur's mastoid bone rendered the alien's pheromone-laced clicks into clipped, aristocratic English. "Traffic in the Sol system," Arthur lied smoothly. He checked his watch. It was a cheap analog thing, the leather strap frayed. 10 minutes past the hour. Earth was supposed to be sending a standard envoy shuttle to formally cede the Orion Cygnus mining rights. "It is a simple procedure," Vial said, his primary eyes blinking independently of his secondary ones. "A single unarmed transport. 3 delegates. A pen on a screen. I do not understand why your Senate required a full month to deliberate." "Bureaucracy, Councillor. You know how it is. We have to make it look like a tough decision for the voters." Arthur rubbed his temples. The observation deck they stood in was a sweeping expanse of curved smart glass, offering a terrifyingly unobstructed view of the gas giant Prime orbited. The swirling storms below were the color of bruised plums. It made Arthur nauseous just looking at it. "Pride," Vial corrected, his voice taking on a patronizing hum. "It is primate pride. You lost the border skirmishes. You lack the shielding technology to withstand our plasma banks. Surrendering the mining rights is merely the logical conclusion of your biological inferiority." Arthur didn't argue. He couldn't. 4 months ago, a Tressian patrol fleet had turned 3 human mining outposts into radioactive glass just to make a point about a territorial dispute. Earth's response had been a deafening, horrifying silence. Then, a capitulation message. "Send a shuttle," the Tressians had demanded. "Come to Prime. Bow your heads." Arthur hated that he was the one standing here to catch the fallout. He hated the starch in his collar. He hated the smell of the air. But mostly, he hated the deep, sinking suspicion in his gut that Earth was about to embarrass itself on a galactic scale. The Senate had been too quiet. No press leaks, no grandstanding politicians on the broadcast networks. Just a dark, oppressive blackout regarding the envoy's departure. A low chime echoed through the observation deck. The ambient light dimmed, shifting from a stark white to a warm, warning amber. "Ah," Vial said, straightening his long, multi-jointed legs. "The jump sensors are picking up a mass shadow. Your shuttle is translating into local space." Arthur exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Right. Well, let's get the welcome mat rolled out. He looked out the massive viewport, expecting to see the tiny, needle-like silhouette of a standard diplomatic cutter slipping quietly into the station's traffic lanes. Instead, the glass began to vibrate. It started as a subtle hum, a vibration that Arthur felt in the metal plates of the floor before he heard it. The loose change in his pocket rattled. The heavy, pressurized doors sealing the deck groaned. Vial's mandibles stopped clicking. The Tressian tilted his head, his antennae whipping forward. "The mass shadow," Vial murmured, the translator rendering his voice with a sudden glitch of static. "It is expanding." Expanding? Arthur stepped closer to the glass. The space outside wasn't empty anymore. About 20 kilometers off the station's starboard bow, the star field was distorting. It looked like looking at the universe through the bottom of a cheap whiskey glass. The light from the distant stars was bending, stretching into long, agonizing smears of white and blue. "Station control!" Vial barked into his wristcom. "Recalibrate the jump sensors. You are feeding us a telemetry error. The mass reading is impossible." Arthur pressed a hand against the smart glass. It was ice cold. The vibrations were climbing up his arm, settling into his chest. His heart rate kicked up, a primal, animal panic flooding his veins. He had seen jump ruptures before. They were quick, surgical tears in space-time. This wasn't a tear. This was a butchery. The fabric of space bulged outward, glowing with a sickly, bruised purple radiation. The ambient noise in the observation deck, the whir of scrubbers, the hum of the lights, was entirely drowned out by a sound that shouldn't exist in a vacuum. It was a deep, seismic roar, transmitted through the gravitational distortions, slamming into the station's hull. "Evacuate the deck!" Vial suddenly shrieked, dropping his diplomatic composure entirely. He grabbed Arthur's sleeve with a clawed hand, ripping the cheap fabric. "It is a localized black hole. The humans have weaponized a singularity." Arthur didn't move. He couldn't. He was paralyzed, staring at the purple blister in reality as it finally burst. It didn't slide gracefully into real space. It breached. When the spatial anomaly collapsed, the resulting shockwave hit Station Prime like a physical blow. The artificial gravity generators screamed, throwing Arthur to his knees. His chin slammed into the polished floor, teeth snapping together hard enough to taste copper. Around him, the beautiful, delicate alien architecture was protesting. Glass shattered in the upper tiers. The amber warning lights flickered and died, replaced by the harsh, bloody crimson of emergency backups. Arthur groaned, pushing himself up onto his elbows. The smell of ozone was overpowering now, mixed with the sharp tang of electrical fires sparking somewhere in the walls. "By the ancestors!" Vial breathed. The alien was on his back, his 4 legs scrambling uselessly against the deck. Arthur looked up at the viewport. The local star, a bright yellow dwarf that usually bathed the station in harsh light, was gone. It had been eclipsed, floating in the void, completely dominating the visual field of the massive window, was a structure that made Arthur's mind reject the scale of it. It wasn't a ship. The word ship implied aerodynamics, grace, purpose. This was a floating mountain of violence. It was roughly rectangular, a slab of brutalist architecture carved from absolute black tungsten. It lacked the smooth aerodynamic curves of Tressian cruisers or the crystalline elegance of the inner core species. Its hull was violently scarred, a patchwork of armor plating that looked like it had been welded together by angry gods. It was 4 miles long, easy. Maybe more. Along its flanks, massive heat radiators pulsed with an angry, dull red glow, bleeding off the catastrophic energy required to force something that massive through slip space. That, Arthur whispered, his throat completely dry. That's not a shuttle. Identify! Vial screamed into his comms, his voice cracking. Control, identify the vessel. Static hissed over the deck's public address system. The station's AI, usually a calm, melodic voice, sounded frantic. Warning. Massive gravitational displacement detected. We are caught in the gravity well of an unidentified super-dreadnought. Thrusters are firing at maximum capacity to maintain orbit. Warning. Target lock detected. We are being painted by error. Radar signature is overriding our sensors. Arthur dragged himself to his feet, using the railing by the glass for support. His head was pounding. He stared at the side of the monstrous vessel. Painted on the scarred black metal, in stark, unforgiving white letters, easily the size of skyscrapers, were 2 words. USN Chicago. The Chicago, Arthur muttered. He started to laugh. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a broken, hysterical wheeze. He remembered reading the classified briefs about Earth's secret orbital shipyards in the Oort cloud. He thought they were propaganda. Pipe dreams to keep the military brass happy while the politicians surrendered the colonies. They weren't dreams. Earth had taken the last 5 years of humiliation, the loss of the border worlds, the condescension of the Galactic Council, and forged it into a blunt instrument. You humans, Vial hissed, finally scrambling to his feet. He looked at Arthur, his primary eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fury. You have broken the treaty. You bring a warship to a diplomatic summit. We will annihilate your homeworld. We will burn Earth to ash. Shut up, Vial, Arthur snapped. The sudden venom in his own voice surprised him. He was usually a coward, or at least deeply pragmatic. But looking at the Chicago, feeling the sheer, unadulterated mass of it, holding the alien station hostage just by existing, something dark and vindictive coiled in his chest. Look at it, Arthur said, pointing a trembling finger at the glass. Massive armor plates along the Chicago's spine were shifting. They didn't glide. They grinded open, the raw mechanical force visible even from miles away. Slowly, agonizingly, the ship was deploying its broadside armament. Rows upon rows of magnetic accelerator cannons, weapons so large they looked like industrial smokestacks, angled themselves toward Station Prime. You said we lacked plasma shielding, Arthur said quietly, the hangover entirely gone, replaced by a cold, sharp adrenaline. I guess we didn't bother inventing it. We just built a gun big enough that we wouldn't need it. The station groaned again as the Chicago adjusted its position. The human dreadnought wasn't just sitting there. It was actively interfering with the station's systems. The lights flickered in time with the pulsing red glow of the ship's engines. They are hailing us, Vial said, his translator struggling to convey the tremor in his voice. Audio only. High-frequency burst. Put it through the deck speakers, Arthur said. Vial hesitated, then tapped his wrist. The speakers popped, a sharp crack of audio feedback that made Arthur wince. Then, a voice filled the room. It wasn't AI synthesized or run through a diplomatic filter. It was raw, human, and heavily accented. The sound of someone who had smoked cheap cigars for 30 years and was currently very, very tired. Station Prime. This is Admiral Thomas Cooper of the United Systems Navy vessel Chicago. We're here for the 1400 hours treaty signing. Sorry we're late. Traffic was a bitch. Arthur rubbed his face with both hands, letting out a long, slow exhale. The sheer, naked arrogance of it. We're experiencing some navigational drift, Cooper's voice continued, casual and unhurried. Gonna need to lock onto your primary docking umbilical. Hope you don't mind. Extend the bridge or we'll just make our own door. Chicago out. He cannot be serious, Vial said, backing away from the glass. Our primary umbilical is designed for light transports. That monster will rip the station apart if it hard docks." "Then you better open the blast doors, Vial," Arthur said, turning away from the window. "Because Cooper isn't bluffing." The docking sequence felt like being inside a tin can while someone beat the outside with a sledgehammer. Arthur stood in the primary airlock concourse, a cavernous hall usually reserved for grand diplomatic processions. It was currently filled with the smell of sweat and fear. 24 station security guards, a mix of reptilian Kral and insectoid Tresians, had formed a semicircle around the massive internal blast door. They held their plasma carbines with trembling hands. The concourse was freezing. The Chicago had locked onto the station, and its immense mass was leaching heat from Prime's life support systems. Arthur could see his own breath pluming in the air. Clang! The sound echoed through the metal floor, vibrating up Arthur's spine. The dreadnought had engaged its magnetic clamps. Vial stood beside Arthur, flanked by 2 of his aides. The alien diplomat looked sickly, his iridescent silk robes practically vibrating with his nervous twitches. "This is an act of war, Representative Arthur. When those doors open, if your commander is accompanied by armed personnel, my guards have orders to fire." Arthur looked at Vial, then at the terrified guards. "If you fire a single shot, Vial, Cooper won't even bother returning it. He'll just detach the clamps and let his ship's engine vaporize this half of the station. Tell them to lower their weapons." "I will not surrender the dignity of the Concorde," Vial snapped. "Dignity doesn't stop tungsten rounds," Arthur replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "Lower the guns. Now." Before Vial could argue, the airlock cycle initiated. The heavy, groaning sound of depressurization filled the hall. A thick cloud of white condensation hissed from the seams of the massive metal door. The station's pristine, sterile air was immediately overwhelmed by a blast of exhaust. The sharp, acrid reek of spent ozone, machine oil, and cold iron. It smelled like an industrial factory floor. The heavy steel doors began to part, grinding on their tracks. The aliens had expected a human diplomatic corps, soft men in silk suits, carrying briefcases of surrender terms. Instead, out of the rolling white fog of the airlock, a shape emerged. It wasn't a diplomat. It was a walking tank. The Marine stepped into the concourse, the magnetic locks on his boots disengaging with a heavy metallic thud that seemed to shake the room. He was clad in experimental boarding armor, matte black, scarred, and devoid of any insignia except for a faded earth sphere painted on the chest plate. He was easily 7 feet tall in the rig. He didn't carry a shiny, elegant plasma rifle. He carried a heavy rotary cannon, slung casually across his chest, the ammo belt feeding into a massive backpack. The station guards instinctively leveled their weapons. The Marine didn't raise his gun. He didn't even slow down. He just reached up, grabbed the seal of his helmet, and twisted it off with a sharp hiss of pressurized air. He tucked the helmet under his arm, revealing a face lined with deep wrinkles, a jagged scar across his chin, and eyes that looked like flint. His hair was cropped military short, completely grey. Admiral Thomas Cooper looked around the room, chewing slowly on an unlit cigar. He looked at the alien guards aiming plasma weapons at him. He looked at Vial. Then his eyes landed on Arthur. "You the attaché?" Cooper asked, his voice a gravelly rasp that didn't need a microphone to carry across the hall. Arthur stepped forward, his knees feeling like water. "Arthur Penhaligon, yes, sir. You look like shit, son," Cooper said, taking the cigar out of his mouth and spitting a fleck of tobacco onto the pristine alien floor. "They feeding you well on this tin can?" "Not really, Admiral." "Figured." Cooper turned his gaze back to Vial. The 2 alien aides shrank back. Vial stood his ground, though his mandibles were clicking in absolute panic. "You must be the bug that ordered the glassing of Mining Outpost Delta," Cooper said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded mildly bored, which Arthur realized was infinitely more terrifying. "I am Councillor Vial of the Tressian Concord," Vial said, his translator voice booming over the speakers, trying to regain control of the room. "You have committed an illegal docking procedure, brought heavy ordnance onto a neutral diplomatic station, and threatened a sovereign council. Explain yourself, human." Cooper smiled. It was a cold, ugly thing. "Explain myself?" Cooper took a heavy step forward. The guards flinched. "4 months ago, you told our government that if we didn't hand over the Orion Cygnus sector, you'd come to Earth and take it by force. You told us we were a primitive, weak species. You told us to send our surrender on a little ship." Cooper gestured with his helmet over his shoulder, back toward the dark, cavernous umbilical tube of the Chicago. Behind him, out of the shadows, the rhythmic, heavy thudding of more magnetic boots echoed in the darkness. Dozens of them. Hundreds. "Well, Counselor," Cooper said, his voice dropping an octave, "we didn't have a little ship available. We were busy building the Chicago. And she runs on the very minerals you tried to take from us." Arthur watched the sweat bead on Vale's carapace. The tension in the room was a physical weight, pressing down on his chest. "Now," Cooper said, tossing his cigar onto the deck and crushing it beneath his armored boot. "Where's the table? We have a treaty to negotiate." The walk to the summit chamber felt like a funeral procession conducted in reverse. Usually, the deceased didn't march toward the grave heavily armed and bleeding radiation. Arthur led the way, his cheap leather shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor plating. Behind him, the rhythmic, deafening clank, clank, clank of magnetic boots destroyed whatever acoustic elegance the station's architects had intended. Admiral Cooper walked a half-step behind Arthur, flanked by 4 Marines in full boarding rigs. They didn't march in parade formation. They moved with the loose, sweeping gait of predators navigating a glass menagerie, their rotary cannons and kinetic shotguns held in low, relaxed grips that somehow made them look infinitely more dangerous. The air in the station's corridors had shifted. The scrubbers were failing to keep up with the Chicago's atmospheric bleed. It smelled like hot metal shavings and old sweat now. The ambient temperature had dropped another 4 degrees. Arthur swallowed hard, trying to keep his hands from shaking. "The council chamber is just past this concourse, Admiral," he said, his voice sounding thin and reedy over the crunch of the Marine's boots. "Good," Cooper rasped. He was still carrying his helmet under his arm. He hadn't bothered to wipe the grease from his chin. "My knees ache. Must be the artificial gravity. Yours always feels slightly out of phase, like standing on a boat." "They calibrate it for the Kral," Vial interjected, from Arthur's right. The Tressian diplomat had kept his distance, walking almost pressed against the curved glass walls of the corridor. "A heavy gravity species. We find your standard 1G to be inadequate." Cooper just grunted, his eyes scanning the delicate, sweeping arches of the corridor. The architecture was organic, grown from bioresins and shaped like the ribs of some ancient leviathan. "Must be a nightmare to patch if there's a hull breach," the Admiral noted, almost to himself. "One solid kinetic slug and this whole hallway shatters." Arthur flinched. He wasn't sure if Cooper was making an architectural observation or a tactical one. With the Admiral, the line seemed entirely non-existent. They reached the grand doors of the summit chamber. 2 massive slabs of pure, synthesized diamond, etched with the treaties of 100 dead worlds. 2 Kral honor guards stood before them, their scales a mottled, angry crimson. They held ceremonial halberds that hummed with a lethal plasma edge. The Kral hissed as the humans approached, their bifurcated tongues tasting the sudden drop in temperature. Cooper didn't stop. He didn't even slow his pace. "Move," he said, the single word dropping from his mouth like a lead weight. The Kral guards braced their halberds, crossing them over the diamond doors. Before Arthur could open his mouth to intervene, the Marine to Cooper's right, a mountain of a woman whose armor bore the faded stencil, Hayes, stepped forward. She didn't raise her weapon, she didn't shout. She simply reached out with one gauntleted hand, grabbed the crossing point of the two plasma halberds, and crushed them. The synthetic metals shrieked. The plasma fields grounded out with a sharp, blinding crack of blue light, showering the floor in sparks. The smell of scorched ozone hit Arthur so hard his eyes watered. The Kral guards stumbled back, staring at their ruined ceremonial weapons in dumbfounded shock. Hayes shoved the broken metal aside and casually pushed her hand against the diamond doors. They didn't open automatically. She forced the pneumatic seals, the massive slabs groaning in protest as she pushed them apart. "After you, sir," Hayes murmured. Her voice filtered through her helmet speakers, sounding like a radio broadcast from the bottom of an ocean. "Much obliged, Corporal," Cooper said. Arthur followed them into the chamber, his heart slamming against his ribs. He felt a sickening, terrifying thrill rush through his veins. For 5 years, he had walked these halls with his head bowed, apologizing for existing. Now, he was riding the wake of a localized hurricane. The summit chamber was vast, circular, and dominated by a central holographic projection table. Seated around the tiered amphitheater were representatives from the 14 primary species of the Galactic Council. They had been waiting. They had been prepared to gloat. Instead, absolute silence fell over the room. It wasn't a respectful silence. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of an ecosystem realizing a new apex predator had just dropped into the watering hole. Cooper walked down the shallow steps toward the central table, his boots gouged deep, ugly scratches into the lacquered wood with every step. He reached the table, looked at the delicate floating holographic chairs intended for the human delegation, and sneered. "Hayes," Cooper said. The corporal unslung a massive, heavy-duty munitions crate from her back and slammed it onto the pristine floor. Cooper sat down on it, his knees spread, resting his forearms on his thighs. He looked up at the tiered seats, his eyes locking onto the center podium, where the High Counselor, an avian species known as the Vex, sat perched. "All right," Cooper said, the word echoing loudly in the cavernous room. "Let's talk real estate." The High Counselor's feathers puffed out, an involuntary biological response to stress. This is an outrage," the Vex squawked, his translator struggling to modulate the high-pitched screech. "You bring heavily armed infantry into the sacred chambers? You deface the floor of the summit? And you arrive in a dreadnought that violates the arms limitation treatises of the inner spiral?" Cooper reached into one of the many pouches on his chest rig. For a second, half the alien delegates flinched, expecting a grenade. Instead, Cooper pulled out a crumpled, slightly damp paper bag. He opened it, dug around, and pulled out a half-eaten protein bar. He took a bite, chewed slowly, and swallowed. "I'm going to stop you right there, Bird," Cooper said, pointing the half-eaten bar at the High Counselor. "Because you're operating under a few critical misconceptions. First, we never signed your arms limitation treatise. You didn't invite us to that summit, remember? You said we lacked the technological maturity to participate in galactic disarmament." Arthur stood behind Cooper, trying to make himself look invisible. He watched the faces of the delegates. Vielle had scurried to his seat, looking thoroughly nauseated. The Kral representative was grinding his teeth, a low, rumbling growl echoing in the lower frequencies of the room. "Second," Cooper continued, tossing the wrapper onto the holographic table, where the lasers desperately tried to render a 3D map of the galaxy over the trash. "This isn't a dreadnought. The Chicago is a Pathfinder vessel. Technically, she's registered as a geological survey ship." A collective murmur of disbelief rippled through the chamber. A survey ship. The Kral delegate practically spat the words, standing up. "It is 4 miles of armor. You have locked magnetic accelerator cannons onto this station. Do not insult our intelligence, human." "She surveys deep core minerals," Cooper said, without blinking. "And sometimes, those minerals are located beneath highly resistant planetary crusts. The cannons are mining equipment. For breaking rocks. Very, very large rocks." The blatant insulting lie hung in the air. It was a diplomatic middle finger, wrapped in razor wire. Arthur felt a hysterical laugh bubbling up in his throat. He bit the inside of his cheek hard enough to draw blood, grounding himself in the sharp, metallic taste. "You are not here to negotiate," the High Counselor said, his feathers flattening against his body. "You are here to threaten us. You think this single ship, this brute force anomaly, gives you leverage? The combined fleets of the Council number in the thousands. We could blockade your sol system within a week." Cooper stopped chewing. He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and slowly stood up from the munitions crate. The casual, weary demeanor vanished, replaced by a sudden, terrifying intensity. The air in the room seemed to compress. "Blockade us," Cooper whispered. The acoustics of the room picked up the sound perfectly. "Please, try it." He tapped a sequence onto the heavy bracer on his left arm. The holographic projector on the table flickered, abandoning its attempt to render the galaxy map. The light shifted from blue to a harsh, tactical red. A schematic appeared in the air. It wasn't of the sol system. It was a live feed, relayed from the Chicago sensor banks. It showed Station Prime. But it also showed the local gas giant they orbited, and the 6 primary jump gates that connected this sector to the inner galaxy. "You see, High Counselor," Cooper said, his voice hard and flat. "We spent 5 years listening to you tell us how pathetic we were, how our kinetic weapons were archaic, how our lack of plasma shielding made us target practice. You told us we were a footnote in the galactic registry." Cooper tapped another button. The live feed zoomed out. Around each of the 6 primary jump gates, localized gravity wells were forming. The telltale purple bruises in space that preceded a slipspace rupture. But these weren't standard ruptures. They were massive. The telemetry data scrolling down the side of the hologram was entirely in red. "The Chicago isn't an anomaly," Cooper said quietly. "She's just the first one off the assembly line." Arthur stared at the hologram, his breath hitched in his chest. 6 massive ruptures, 6 more mass shadows, identical to the Chicago, tearing their way into real space, effectively boxing in the entire system. "The Detroit," Cooper listed, pointing at the glowing blips. "The Pittsburgh, the Mumbai, the London, the Tokyo, the Sao Paulo. All registered as geological survey ships, of course." The silence in the room was absolute now. The hum of the holographic table was the only sound. Several of the delegates were openly trembling. Vial had slumped back in his chair, his mandibles slack. "You wanted our outer colonies," Cooper said, turning his back on the hologram and looking directly at the Kral delegate. "You glassed 3 of our mining outposts because you wanted the tungsten, the uranium, the heavy metals." Cooper stepped closer to the table, leaning his weight on his knuckles. "Well, congratulations. You got what you wanted. We gathered up all that tungsten, all that depleted uranium, and we brought it right to your front door. Delivered at relativistic speeds." Cooper reached into his vest again. He didn't pull out a data pad or a digital ledger. He pulled out a thick, heavy sheaf of actual paper, bound in a leather folder, and tossed it onto the table. It landed with a loud, authoritative smack. "That is the new treaty," Cooper said. "We aren't giving you the Orion Cygnus sector. We are annexing the neutral buffer zones. Earth takes full control of the transit lanes from Sol to the Perseus Arm. And the Tresian Concord is going to pay reparations for the 3 outposts they burned, calculated with interest." "You are mad," the High Counselor whispered. "You are holding a diplomatic station hostage. This is terrorism." "No," Cooper said, his eyes dead and cold. "This is a negotiation. The kind you understand. You brought plasma banks to a border dispute, High Counselor. We brought the industrial might of a species that spent the last 3,000 years perfecting the art of killing each other. Now, who has a pen?" Arthur had never seen paper used in a diplomatic setting. The galactic standard was biometric thumbprints on smart glass tablets. The physical heft of the document sitting on the table felt archaic, heavy with an implied permanence. It was a physical manifestation of Earth's stubbornness. No one moved. The Kral delegate, a massive, muscle-bound creature named Drusk, was breathing heavily. The air whistled through his facial ridges. His species had built their empire on physical dominance and martial pride. To be cornered like this, humiliated by a species they considered barely more than hairless apes, was visibly tearing him apart. "I will not sign," Drusk snarled, his voice a low earthquake. "We do not bow to kinetic primitives. If you fire those weapons, you die with us. Your ships are slow. Our fleets will outmaneuver you in the void." Cooper didn't blink. He just stared at Drusk. "We don't need to outmaneuver you. Space is a vacuum, Drusk. There's no friction. When we fire a 3-ton depleted uranium slug from a magnetic coil gun at a fraction of the speed of light, it doesn't stop. It doesn't dissipate like your plasma. It keeps going until it hits something." Cooper leaned forward slightly. "Maybe it hits your ship. Maybe it misses and flies through the dark for 1,000 years until it hits a civilian transport. Maybe it hits your home world. Sir Isaac Newton is the deadliest son of a bitch in space. And we just brought 7 million of his best arguments to your doorstep." "Empty words!" Drusk roared. He slammed a massive clawed fist onto the desk in front of him, shattering the holographic projector unit built into it. "I call your bluff, ape!" Drusk lunged over the tiered desk. He was fast. Terrifyingly fast for something that weighed nearly 800 pounds. He didn't go for a weapon. His claws were lethal enough. He aimed straight for Cooper, intending to crush the Admiral's skull right there on the floor. Arthur's heart stopped. He tried to shout, tried to step forward, but his body was frozen, paralyzed by the sudden explosion of violence. Cooper didn't flinch. He didn't even raise his hands. Corporal Hayes moved. It was a burst of kinetic energy that defied the bulk of her armor. She stepped into Drusk's path. She didn't try to grapple the massive alien or block his strike. She simply lowered her shoulder and engaged the localized thrusters built into the back of her suit. Crack. The sound of the impact was sickening. It wasn't the heroic clash of titans. It was the ugly, wet sound of a heavy machine hitting biological matter. Hayes's shoulder plate, reinforced with layers of impact-absorbing gel and tungsten, caught Drusk squarely in the sternum. The 800-pound alien was lifted entirely off his feet. His momentum was violently reversed. He flew backward, crashing into the tier of desks behind him, shattering wood, glass and metal in a chaotic tangle of limbs. Drusk hit the floor and didn't get up. A dark, viscous blue liquid began to pool beneath his cracked chest plate. He was wheezing, his lungs struggling to draw air through the shattered ribs. The silence that followed was so profound, Arthur could hear the soft, frantic ticking of his analog watch. Hayes casually rolled her shoulder, letting the thrusters cool with a soft hiss. She didn't look at the fallen alien. She returned to her parade rest stance behind Cooper, her hands loosely gripping her rotary cannon. "I apologize for the interruption," Cooper said to the room, his voice perfectly level. He pulled a cheap plastic ballpoint pen from his breast pocket and tossed it onto the paper treaty. It skittered across the table and stopped near the edge. "I believe the Kral delegate recuses himself from the vote," Cooper added. He looked up at the Vex High Counselor. Are there any other objections to the terms of the treaty? Or do we need to demonstrate the mining capabilities of our new fleet?" The High Counselor stared at Drusk's broken body, then at the pen. His feathers were so flat against his skin he looked half-starved. Slowly, with trembling talons, he descended from his podium. He didn't speak. He reached the table, picked up the cheap plastic pen, and stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. He didn't know how to use it. Arthur found his legs. He stepped forward, his cheap shoes no longer squeaking, but moving with a sudden, calm purpose. He reached out, gently took the pen from the alien's claws, clicked the top to expose the ballpoint, and handed it back. "Press firmly," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly steady. "It requires friction to lay the ink." The High Counselor looked at Arthur. The absolute terror in the alien's black eyes was a stark contrast to the arrogant sneer Vielle had worn just an hour ago. The galaxy had shifted on its axis, and Arthur was standing precisely at the fulcrum. The alien dragged the pen across the dotted line, tearing the paper slightly in his haste. One by one, the other delegates came down. No one spoke. The only sound in the room was the scratching of the ballpoint pen, the harsh, wet breathing of the bleeding Kral, and the distant, omnipresent hum of the Chicago's reactor core vibrating through the deck plates. When Vielle's turn came, he wouldn't meet Arthur's eyes. He signed his name with a jagged, jerky motion, leaving a smudge of ink on the page. When the last signature was laid, Cooper reached out and pulled the folder back. He checked the pages, closed it, and tucked it under his arm next to his helmet. "A pleasure doing business with you," Cooper said. He turned on his heel. "Attaché Penhaligon, walk with me. I need a drink, and I hear this station has a decent synthetic bourbon." Arthur stood frozen for a fraction of a second. He looked at the room full of the most powerful beings in the sector, now reduced to silent, terrified witnesses. He looked at the broken halberds, the shattered desks, the blood on the floor. Then he adjusted his collar. It didn't feel quite so tight anymore. "Actually, Admiral," Arthur said, falling into step beside the old Marine as they walked back toward the diamond doors. "The bourbon here tastes like engine coolant, but I know a place in the lower wards that imports the real stuff from Kentucky." "Lead the way, son," Cooper rasped, clapping a heavy armored hand on Arthur's shoulder. "Lead the way." Behind them, the massive diamond doors hissed shut, sealing the council inside with their shattered pride and the terrifying realization that the galaxy no longer belonged to them. The adrenaline crash hit Arthur in the station's primary freight elevator. It wasn't a sudden drop. It was a slow, sickening leak that started in his knees and pooled in his stomach. The elevator carriage was a massive, rusted cage designed to move industrial cargo to the lower wards, not diplomats. It smelled of hydraulic fluid, ozone, and the faint, sweet decay of uncollected garbage. Arthur gripped the chain-link wall of the cage, his knuckles white. He closed his eyes, focusing on the rhythmic clack, clack, clack of the elevator, descending the central spine of Station Prime. He felt incredibly, violently ill. To his left, Admiral Cooper stood perfectly still. The old Marine had his helmet tucked under his arm again, his breathing deep and even. But in the harsh, flickering fluorescent light of the cage, Arthur could see the deep grey bags under Cooper's eyes. The man didn't look like a victorious conqueror. He looked like someone who had been awake for a week straight, surviving entirely on caffeine and spite. Corporal Hayes and the other 3 Marines stood at the corners of the cage, facing outward. They didn't speak. They didn't relax. Their armored suits hummed faintly, a low-frequency vibration that rattled Arthur's teeth. "You're shaking, son," Cooper said over the screech of the elevator brakes. He didn't look at Arthur. "It's cold," Arthur lied. His jaw was clenched so tight His temples throbbed. "The atmospheric scrubbers down here are terrible. The heat doesn't circulate." "It's the crash," Cooper corrected, reaching into a pouch on his chest rig and pulling out a silver flask. He unscrewed the cap and held it out. "Drink." Arthur didn't argue. He took the flask. The metal was warm from being pressed against the armor. He took a sip, expecting water, and instantly choked as a mouthful of liquid fire burned its way down his esophagus. It tasted like rubbing alcohol mixed with engine degreaser. He coughed, his eyes watering, and handed it back. "God, what is that?" "Potato vodka, distilled in the Chicago's hydroponics bay. Tastes like jet fuel, but it stops the shakes." Cooper took a long pull from the flask himself, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "You did good back there, Penhaligon, handing that bird the pen. That was a nice touch." "Theatrical?" "I thought Drusk was going to rip your head off," Arthur admitted, his voice raspy. Cooper chuckled. It was a dry, scraping sound, like two stones grinding together. He tried. But kinetic energy is a funny thing. Aliens, they rely on energy fields, shields, plasma. They forgot what it means to just hit something really, really hard with a solid object. The elevator slammed to a halt, the cage rattling violently. The heavy metal grates slid open with a screech of unoiled tracks. The lower wards of Station Prime were a sprawling, chaotic slum. This was where the station's mechanics, the dock workers, and the black market smugglers lived. It was a tight, claustrophobic warren of narrow corridors constructed from salvaged shipping containers and exposed pipework. The lighting was poor, casting long, jagged shadows across floors, slick with condensation and nameless fluids. Neon signs in a dozen different alien scripts sputtered and buzzed, throwing harsh reds and sickly greens against the damp walls. The locals, a mix of lower-caste Tressians missing limbs, scaled Grax workers in grease-stained overalls, and a smattering of human expats who had nowhere else to go, froze as the elevator doors opened. They had never seen Earth Marine boarding armor. They took one look at the 5 towering figures of black tungsten, and immediately pressed themselves against the walls, lowering their eyes. "Lead the way, attaché," Cooper said, stepping out of the cage. His boots splashed in a puddle of oily water. Arthur adjusted his cheap suit jacket, trying to muster some shred of dignity, and started walking. They moved through the market district. The smells were overwhelming here. Roasted synthetic meat skewers snapping over open induction coils, the sharp tang of illicit narcotic smoke, the sour reek of unwashed bodies. Usually, Arthur kept his head down when he came down here. He walked fast, avoiding eye contact. Today was different. He was walking in the center of a heavily armed escort that could probably level the entire sector in under 4 minutes. The absolute silence that followed them was deafening. "Place is called the Rusty Nail," Arthur said, pointing toward a dead-end alley bathed in a flickering orange glow. "Bartender's name is Bennett. He's from Chicago, actually. Left Earth before the border skirmishes." "Good," Cooper said. "Let's see if he remembers how to pour." Hayes took point, turning down the alley. She stopped in front of a heavy, reinforced steel door covered in alien graffiti. She didn't knock. She just grabbed the handle, applied a fraction of the suit's servo-assisted strength, and forced the locking mechanism to yield with a loud snap. They walked in. The bar was completely empty, save for a few slumped figures at the back booths who immediately scrambled out the emergency exit upon seeing the rotary cannons. The air inside was thick with stale smoke and the smell of cheap yeast. Behind the bar, a balding, heavy-set human with a stained apron froze. He was holding a dirty rag inside a glass. He stared at the Marines, his mouth slightly open. "Bennett?" Arthur asked, stepping out from behind Hayes. Bennett blinked, his eyes darting to Arthur, then back to the 7-foot walking tanks. Arthur? What? What the hell is this? Did the Geneva Corps finally decide to pay my outstanding bar tab? We're thirsty, Bennett, Cooper said, stepping up to the bar. The floorboards groaned ominously under his weight. He placed his heavy, scarred helmet on the sticky wood of the bar top. The attaché here says you've got real Kentucky bourbon. Bennett swallowed hard, tossing the rag aside. I do. Costs a week's pay for a shot. Cooper reached to his belt, unclasped a small leather pouch, and tossed it onto the bar. It landed with a heavy metallic clink. There's 2 ounces of refined weapons-grade palladium in there. Leave the bottle, and tell your friends outside to take a walk. We need the room. Bennett looked at the pouch, then at Cooper. He didn't say a word. He reached under the counter, pulled out a dusty glass bottle filled with dark amber liquid, and set it down alongside 2 relatively clean glasses. Then he grabbed his coat and hurried out the back door. Hayes, Cooper commanded, not looking back. Secure the perimeter. Nobody comes in. Sir, Hayes replied. The 4 Marines fanned out, locking the heavy steel door and taking up positions at the structural choke points. Cooper grabbed the bottle. He popped the cork with his teeth, spat it onto the floor, and poured 2 generous measures. He slid one across the sticky wood to Arthur. Drink up, Penhaligon, Cooper said, picking up his glass. We've got about 40 minutes before the adrenaline completely leaves your system and you realize what we just did. Arthur looked at the amber liquid. He picked it up, his hand trembling slightly. He clinked his glass against Cooper's. To Earth, Arthur said quietly. To Earth, Cooper echoed. They drank. The bourbon was smooth, burning with a warm, oaky fire that chased the chill from Arthur's chest. For a moment, it was just the 2 of them in a quiet bar. Then, Cooper set his glass down, leaned heavily against the counter, and let out a breath that sounded like a tire losing pressure. All right, Cooper said, staring at the empty glass. Now I'm going to tell you the truth. Arthur wiped his mouth with the back of his sleeve. The cheap fabric scratched against his skin. The truth about what? Cooper didn't answer immediately. He began to unlatch his chest plate. The heavy tungsten armor hissed as the pressure seals broke. He pulled the front plate off, setting it heavily on the floor, revealing a dark green, sweat-stained military undershirt. His arms were corded with muscle, but his hands, Arthur noticed now, watching them rest on the bar, were shaking. It wasn't the subtle tremor of a hangover. It was a deep, neurological shudder. You think we beat them, Cooper said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper. He poured himself another shot. You think we kicked down the door, threw our weight around, and secured the sector. You think the Chicago is a miracle? I saw it, Arthur said, frowning. I saw the guns. I saw the sensor data. 7 dreadnoughts. Cooper let out a short, bitter laugh. It had no humor in it. He picked up his glass, swirling the amber liquid, watching the light refract through the cheap glass. The Chicago is real, Cooper said slowly. Her hull is real. The guns are real. The reactor is mostly stable. He paused, looking up at Arthur with eyes that looked incredibly old. But she doesn't have life support in sections 4 through 9. The atmospheric recyclers are cannibalized from civilian transports. If we engage in a sustained firefight for more than 20 minutes, the reactor heat bleeds into the crew decks and cooks everyone alive. Arthur stared at him. The ambient hum of the bar's faulty neon sign suddenly sounded incredibly loud. What? We didn't build a dreadnought, Arthur, Cooper said softly. We built a gun with a massive engine strapped to it, wrapped it in whatever armor plating we could strip from the lunar colonies, and prayed it wouldn't tear itself apart in slip space. But the armor, the depleted uranium, Scraped from the ruin of the old North American craters, Cooper said. We emptied the strategic reserves. We halted all civilian manufacturing. Do you know what the rationing is like on Earth right now? People are eating synthesized algae paste 3 meals a day. We turned the entire global economy into a single, desperate, suicide play. Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. The warmth of the bourbon vanished, replaced by a cold, sinking dread. The other ships, the Detroit, the London. Decoys, Cooper said, taking another drink. Hollow shells. Frameworks of scaffolding bolted to industrial fusion drives. They have the mass shadow of a dreadnought. They bleed the radiation of a dreadnought. But if you hit one with a solid kinetic slug, it would shatter like glass. There's a skeleton crew of 20 volunteers on each one, just keeping the engines running so the sensor data looks real. Arthur gripped the edge of the bar. The sticky wood dug into his palms. You bluffed them. You brought an entire armada to a diplomatic summit, and 6 of them are empty boxes. If Drusk hadn't backed down, Cooper said, looking at his shaking hands, if the High Counselor had called our bluff, we would have fired the Chicago's main battery. We would have crippled this station, and then the Tressian fleet would have jumped in and slaughtered us. It would have taken them about 10 minutes. The silence in the dive bar was absolute. Arthur couldn't breathe. The sheer, terrifying audacity of it. Earth hadn't won a war. They had walked into a casino with their life savings, bet it all on a pair of 2s, and screamed at the dealer until he folded. Why? Arthur whispered. Why risk everything on a bluff? Cooper leaned across the bar. The smell of stale sweat, ozone, and bourbon was heavy on his breath. Because we were dying the death of 1,000 cuts, Arthur. They took the border worlds. Next year they would have taken the asteroid belt. The year after that, Mars. They were going to legislate us into extinction. We had to make them believe we were completely, violently insane. We had to make the cost of fighting us so high, so unbelievably bloody, that they wouldn't even try. Cooper reached out and grabbed Arthur's shoulder. His grip was painfully tight. They expect us to be civilized, to play by the rules of their treaties. But you can't negotiate with a bear by reading it a contract. You have to hit it in the nose with a rock. Cooper released Arthur and stepped back, picking up his armor plate. We hit them, and they blinked. But what happens when they find out? Arthur asked, his voice trembling. They have spies. They have intelligence networks. Eventually, someone is going to scan the London and realize it's empty. Cooper began reattaching his chest plate. The locks engaged with a heavy, final click. That's the best part, son. They won't. Arthur frowned. How can you be sure? Because of the treaty you just got them to sign, Cooper said, a grim, cynical smile touching the corners of his scarred mouth. We annexed the buffer zones. We control the transit lanes, which means any Tressian ship that enters our space to scan our fleet is committing an act of war. And after today, they are absolutely terrified of starting a war with us. Cooper grabbed his helmet from the bar. We bought ourselves time, Arthur. 10 years, maybe 15. Time to actually build the ships we pretended to have today. Time to get our economy back on its feet. Time to turn the Sol system into a fortress. Arthur looked down at his empty glass. He felt entirely numb. The galaxy hadn't shifted because humanity was strong. It had shifted because humanity was desperate enough to put a gun to its own head and threaten to pull the trigger if the aliens didn't back off. So why are you telling me this? Arthur asked, looking up at the Admiral. Cooper stepped closer. The imposing, terrifying bulk of the armor was back in place. Because I'm leaving. The Chicago needs to get back to space dock before her reactor melts down. The decoys are jumping back to Sol in 20 minutes. Cooper reached into his pouch and pulled out a small, heavy, black datapad. He set it on the bar in front of Arthur. "You're the new ambassador to the Galactic Council, Penhaligon," Cooper said softly. "The Senate rubber-stamped your promotion this morning. Congratulations." Arthur stared at the datapad. "Me? I'm an attaché. I organize catering for subcommittee meetings. I can't be the ambassador. You need a general, a politician. We need someone who knows the aliens," Cooper corrected. "Someone who has lived here, who knows how they think. More importantly, we need someone they recognize. You stood next to me today. You handed the High Counselor the pen. To them, you are the face of the madness." Cooper turned toward the door. "Hayes, fall in. We're moving out." The Marines unsealed the steel door, stepping out into the neon-lit alley. "Arthur," Cooper said, pausing in the doorway. The flickering orange light cast long shadows across his grey hair. "Your job isn't to negotiate anymore. Your job is to sit in that summit chamber, smile, and never, ever let them see you sweat. You hold the line. Do you understand?" Arthur looked at the datapad. He looked at the bottle of bourbon. Slowly, he reached out and wrapped his fingers around the cold metal of the datapad. "I understand, Admiral." "Good," Cooper grunted. "Try not to drink all of Bennett's bourbon. You're going to need a clear head for the press conference." The walk back up to the primary observation deck was different. Arthur didn't walk behind the Marines this time. He walked beside Cooper. When they reached the upper concourses, the alien crowds didn't just step aside. They vanished. Entire corridors emptied out before them. The station security personnel actively turned their backs, refusing to make eye contact with the humans. Fear. It was a tangible texture in the air, thicker than the ozone bleed from the Chicago. They reached the primary airlock concourse. The massive steel doors were still open, the white condensation rolling out of the umbilical tube like ground fog. The smell of cold iron and machine oil was overpowering. Vielle was waiting near the airlock. The Tressian diplomat had changed his silk robes. He was wearing something darker, less iridescent, the color of mourning. He stood flanked by his aides, but he looked incredibly small. As Cooper and the Marines approached, Vielle stepped forward, his mandibles clicking nervously. "Admiral Cooper," Vielle said, his translator voice muted, lacking all its former arrogance. "The Council has initiated the transfer of the Orion Cygnus credentials. The reparations will begin processing at the start of the next fiscal cycle." "Make sure it's in raw materials, Counselor," Cooper said, not breaking stride. "We don't want your fiat currency. We want the tungsten." "Understood," Vielle murmured, bowing his head slightly. It was a submissive gesture, a terrifyingly fast capitulation. Vielle then looked at Arthur. "Representative Penhaligon, the High Counselor has requested a formal meeting tomorrow to discuss the new border patrols." Arthur felt a spike of panic in his chest. A meeting. Alone. Without 4 miles of depleted uranium and a squad of Marines to back him up. He thought about the empty hulls of the London and the Detroit. He thought about the starving people on Earth eating algae paste. He forced his face to go completely blank. He channeled every ounce of cynical, bureaucratic exhaustion he had accumulated over the last 5 years, and mixed it with the cold, unyielding silence he had learned from Cooper in the last hour. "Tell the High Counselor," Arthur said, his voice slow and remarkably steady, "that my schedule is currently full. I will review the border patrol parameters when I have the time. If he has an issue with the delay, he can submit a formal complaint to the Sol Defense Grid." Vile's eyes widened. He shrank back slightly. I will relay your message, Ambassador." Arthur didn't correct the title. He just gave a curt nod. Cooper stopped at the threshold of the airlock. He turned to look at Arthur. For a second, The hard, flinty look in the old marine's eyes softened. It was just a flicker, a momentary acknowledgement of the massive, impossible burden he had just dropped on Arthur's shoulders. Cooper reached up and tapped his chest plate in a brief, informal salute. "Hold the line, Ambassador," Cooper said. "Have a safe flight, Admiral," Arthur replied, returning the nod. "Watch the reactor heat." Cooper smirked around a fresh, unlit cigar. He turned, snapped his helmet onto his collar, and marched into the rolling white fog of the umbilical. Hayes and the other Marines followed, their heavy magnetic boots thudding in perfect synchronization until the sound was swallowed by the cavernous dark of the ship. "Clear the umbilical," Arthur ordered the station control crew. "Initiate detachment sequence." The heavy internal blast doors groaned, sliding shut with a massive, vibrating boom that echoed through the concourse. The airlock sealed. Arthur walked over to the sweeping smart glass viewport. Vielle stood a few feet away, watching him warily. Outside, the Chicago was coming alive. The massive magnetic clamps along the hull disengaged with a violent shudder that rocked Station Prime. The amber warning lights flashed across the observation deck. Slowly, agonizingly, the 4-mile-long slab of black tungsten began to drift backward. The immense heat radiators along its flanks pulsed from a dull red to a blinding, angry crimson. The station's artificial gravity struggled to compensate for the shifting mass, making Arthur's stomach pitch. In the distance, Arthur could see the 6 localized gravity wells, the fleet, waiting in the dark. The Chicago didn't turn around. It engaged its main thrusters while still facing the station, an arrogant, aggressive maneuver that bathed the smart glass in a wash of hard radiation and blinding white light. The smart glass instantly polarized, darkening to protect the observers. But the sheer physical force of the engine wash rattled the reinforced panes. Arthur placed his hand against the vibrating glass. It was warm now. He watched as the massive dreadnought slipped into the formation with the 6 decoys. The space around them began to distort, twisting and bulging with the purple bruising of a slip space rupture. They're held together by duct tape and spit, Arthur thought, watching the terrifying display of power. And they just conquered the galaxy. The ruptures collapsed inward, swallowing the massive ships in a flash of blinding, silent light. And just like that, space was empty again. The local yellow dwarf star, no longer eclipsed by the Chicago, bathed the station in harsh, unforgiving light. The silence in the observation deck was absolute. Vielle cleared his throat nervously. "Ambassador Penhaligon, would you require an escort back to your quarters?" Arthur stood there for a long moment. He looked at his reflection in the glass. He looked tired. His cheap suit was wrinkled, his collar was frayed, and he could still taste the bitter burn of synthetic potato vodka in the back of his throat. He wasn't a hero. He was a low-level bureaucrat who had been handed the keys to a kingdom made of glass. But as he looked at the empty space where the Chicago had been, he felt something else beneath the fear and the exhaustion. Pride. A fierce, ugly, deeply human pride. Arthur turned away from the window, slipping his hands into his pockets. He let his fingers brush against the cold metal of the datapad Cooper had given him. "No, Counselor," Arthur said, walking past the alien without looking at him. "I know the way. Send a cleaning crew to the summit chamber, and tell them to leave the Kral blood on the floor. I want it there for the morning session." Arthur didn't wait to see Vielle's reaction. He just kept walking down the pristine, curved hallway of the alien station, his cheap shoes squeaking softly against the floor plating, carrying the heaviest secret in the universe. And that concludes. They expected a shuttle, not Earth's galaxy's most powerful warship. Humanity didn't win with elegant diplomacy. We won with sheer audacity, a mountain of depleted uranium, and the greatest bluff in galactic history. What did you think of Admiral Cooper's insane gambit? Could you have held your nerve like Arthur? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this HFY story, smash that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our weekly sci-fi uploads. Share this video with a fellow Terran, and as always, thank you for listening. See you in the void.